Welcome to the webinar, Change the Economy to Save the Climate. I am Alessio Pisano. I am a freelancer journalist in Brussels. Before giving you some technical information about the webinar itself, I would like to introduce, to give the floor to Diego Isabel Lamoneda, Director of the Global Hub and the NESI Forum. Just please be sure that your mic is unmuted. Hi, Diego.
Hi, Alessio. Just to say hello and welcome to all the participants and the speakers. Just to say that this webinar is co-hosted by the New Economist Foundation and by the Global Hub for the Common Good. Both think tanks are working together in co-organizing the Global Forum, NESI, the New Economy and Social Innovation Forum that will take place next year in April in Malaga. But as many of you already know, NESI is an open and permanent forum. We want to open the discussion about how to co-create a new economy by civil society, activists, business people, entrepreneurs, policymakers, academics. So today I think it's a good start to talk about how to change the economy. We want to change the climate change. I give the floor to the speakers, and just to apologize because finally, for different reasons, all the speakers are men. But just to explain that in New Economist Foundation and Global Hub we are more women. So hopefully also next time we got more women speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Diego. Thanks very much. Very briefly, I need to give you some technical information to get the best out of the webinar. As I told you, be careful to have the microphone off when you are not talking. And if you wish to intervene, please raise a hand. Let's say on the chat box on the right side of the screen. The public can ask any kind of questions to the speakers, of course related to the issue, through this chat or via Twitter using the hashtag NESI Climate Justice. We will try to do our best to answer most of them. If someone has any technical problem, please indicate this privately to the NESI user in the chat. Perfect. Now it's a pleasure to introduce and give a warm welcome to the three speakers that we have with us today. We have Hans Brunix, the Executive Director of the European Environment Agency. Dr. Brunix has conducted several researches in areas such as environmental politics, climate change, sustainable development. Welcome, Dr. Brunix. Then we have Robert Pollin, Professor of Economics and Co-Director of the Political Economic Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in the States. He also founder and president of the green energy company operating throughout the States. Welcome, Dr. Pollin. And last but not least, of course, we have Michel Genet, currently head of Ethiopia, a green think tank in Belgium. Among others, Dr. Genet has been head of Greenpeace Belgium for 7 years, chair of Greenpeace Europe, as well chair of the Belgian Climate Coalition. Welcome, Dr. Genet. Well, to kick off the debate, I would like to ask to our speaker to give to help us to understand briefly what are the connection between the current economic system and the climate challenges that we have to face. What changes in the economy should happen for climate justice, and how you think different actors, I'm thinking about civil society, business, institutions, and even academics, can collaborate to catalyze these changes. Maybe Dr. Brunix could start.
Okay, well, thank you first of all for inviting me to the webinar. I'm looking forward to the introductions by the other speakers, but even more so to the questioning and the answering session that is at the end of this webinar. Let me start by saying that when we look at the current system from the perspective of environment, natural resources, and climate, I think there are three essential elements that we have to look at when we we reflect on the sustainability of the system of production and consumption. One is that it's clear that we use too much energy and of the wrong type. Yeah, that's a rather essential characteristic of the system. The second one is that we use too many natural resources in a highly linear way. So we dig up stuff or extract it. We produce things that are often not very well produced and that only last for a very short time period. And then we dispose of them in a highly inefficient way, which is a waste of materials and a waste of value in economic cycles. And thirdly, and this is often underestimated, I think, we keep depleting and degrading our natural capital base, ecosystems, biodiversity, whatever term you want to use nowadays, in an essential way instead of protecting it and strengthening it. And you can think here of forests, of land and soil, of oceans, all of which play an essential role in the carbon cycle, but also in creating a system that is resilient enough to deal with the changes that are already happening and that we will be facing. So that's from an economic, a natural capital and resource perspective. When you look at it from a perspective of more equity and distribution, it's clear that we have a number of distributional issues that exist. Large inequalities within societies and across societies, but increasingly within. And secondly, a very unequal distribution in the capacities on how to influence what is happening and how we will deal with the consequences, the costs and benefits, and the distribution thereof in the system. Thirdly, I think we face a failure in the current system to include the full cost and the long-term implications of decisions that we make. And the two are not the same. I think we should reflect on how this long-term element is increasingly playing a role in how we deal with the challenges of the economy of the 21st century. Our conclusion here in the agency, and we did that in our last State and Outlook of the Environment report in 2015, is that we are facing with a fundamentally unsustainable system of production and consumption that is on top of that spreading around the globe, which is an essential component of globalization. Now, not to talk too long, what then should happen to achieve more climate justice and a more fundamentally sustainable system? Well, first of all, when you think of justice, I think you can make a distinction to a certain degree about what we could call the intra-generational justice and distributional issues, which is now, today, but also in the long term, that's the intergenerational. And I think for the first one, it's redistribution of costs and benefits of the current system and capacities is highly needed. And secondly, in intergenerational, it is the fundamental shift, the transition to systems of production and consumption that are fundamentally sustainable. In our estimate, we need to move away from the efficiency paradigm and go to the transitions paradigm. And with the efficiency paradigm, I mean the following. Most of our policies have been focusing over the last 40 years in the field of environment and climate on making the current systems more efficient. Our cars are more efficient, our refrigerators are more efficient, our energy production is more efficient, but the efficiency paradigm has sort of tangential limits that we are reaching. And if we look at the 2050 objectives of a low carbon society, a circular economy, and high natural capital, we will not get there by moving the efficiency curve 0.7 or 1.3% per year. We will need to move to fundamentally different systems. That means, in essence, from high carbon to low carbon, from a linear model to a circular model, and from depleting and degrading natural capital to fundamentally strengthening this. And the way in which we look at this, we focus on the 4 key systems which we think that need to go through a transition. And that is the energy system, the food and agricultural system, the mobility and transport system, and the urban development system. And we will not get there with the efficiency paradigm. Now, in order to do that, two things are rather essential. First of all, a systemic approach, which includes the functioning of the financial system, of the fiscal system, of distributional policies, of how we make policies. Those are governance issues, of values and lifestyles. So the time that you could approach this by taking bad chemicals out of the water or out of air, which is the pollution and efficiency paradigm, those days are past us to a large extent. So a systemic approach. And in the finance system, you can think of the sort of strange element in some of the climate negotiations, which is getting $100 billion together for a climate fund on the one hand, versus the trillions that are flying around in the financial system on every single day. So how does that relate to each other? What is the connection there? There is a lot of work being done on greening the financial system. And the second important issue for us is avoiding lock-ins. And if I look at the climate objectives in a 2030, 2050 perspective, we can reach the 2030 perspective and goals in Europe of minus 40% by making the current system more efficient. That's feasible. But we will be in the next 15 years investing all of our R&D and innovation in the old system and making that more efficient. And that might lock us into that technology and actually close pathways to 2050. So the question is not, will we reach the 2030 objectives? I don't think that's that big of a deal in Europe. We can do it. The question is, will we reach it through a lock-in that will close pathways to 2050, or will we get there by opening up pathways to 2050? And it requires a very different set of investments, a very different R&D policy, a very different public and private sort of in engagement in these types of policies. To give you one example, 2 weeks ago we came out with a report on carbon lock-ins in the energy system, and if we don't shift our investments by 2030, our estimate is that we will have between 20 and 25% excess capacity in the carbon-based energy system in Europe if we want to reach the 40%, and those will translate into stranded assets. So that's a rather significant issue. And then thirdly and briefly, how do I see the role of different actors? I think I can be very brief there. We are not talking about some muddling in the margins. We are talking about fundamental societal change. So by definition, that includes the engagement, whether in a forward-looking way or with the brakes on, of all actors in society. It's inconceivable that you would reach a low-carbon society on a global scale or even on a local scale without involving all major segments of society. Now, the way in which this plays out is to a large part governance. This has to do with power relations. It has to do with vested interests in an old system or in a new system. It has to do with values that people and organizations have. But in essence, I think it's completely inconceivable that this will happen with one or two or even three major groups, and that you can ignore everybody else. I suggest that I leave it at that. I'm very happy to intervene in the subsequent discussion, but I'm happy to leave the floor to the other speakers.
Thanks, Dr. Brunix. Of course, these transition paradigm is absolutely relevant to start thinking about this concretely. Dr. Collin, how could we achieve a better climate justice?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. And I very much look forward to the general discussion. Being an economist, I'm going to throw up some numbers. And I have a PowerPoint that enables me to get through these numbers. So I hope everyone can see it. So let's go to, now I'm trying to get it to move. Okay. And of course, I will be very happy to respond to Dr. Brunig's very important comments. My approach will be different in that it'll be more specific, and it's, for the moment, I'm going to focus on 20-year targets. So first of all, maybe it goes without saying to this group that we are nowhere close to hitting something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's goals for CO2 reductions. And I am also going to focus on CO2 reductions and for the moment leave aside other sources of greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental issues. So what you're seeing in this first slide is, on the left-hand side, actual levels of CO2 emissions as of 2012, which is 32 billion tons. The International Energy Agency, their baseline assumption for 2035 is the next bar, which is 43 billion tons. So totally contrary to where we need to go, the baseline projection of this mainstream agency is that emissions are going to increase over the next 20 years, by something like 30%. So unless we do something quite dramatic, that's where we're going to be. And talk about lock-in, we will not be able to achieve any kind of reasonable stabilization goal. Now, the agency also projects what they call a new policies agenda. And under their new policies agenda, where it's something like 37 billion tons, so it is more modest, but nevertheless an increase relative to actual level of 32 billion tons. Now, this number is significant because I think this number is pretty close to where the world would be if all of the commitments made in Paris last year were fulfilled. If all of the commitments are made in Paris, more or less we are still either at a stable level of emissions or a modest increase over the next 20 years, which is disastrous. So what I've done in the last bar is project the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change targets, moving it to a 20-year projection, an intermediate projection, in order to get to something like a 2-degree stabilization goal for the global climate. And that means that within 20 years, and this is a conservative assumption, we have to be at 20 billion tons. We're at 30 billion tons of CO2 emissions now. We have to be at 20 billion tons. So we're nowhere close to hitting that target if we either follow a baseline level of economic activity, or if we accept the agreements in Paris as adequate for achieving a reasonable stabilization goal within 20 years. Okay, so what to do about it? And I certainly embrace the spirit of what Dr. Brunig said in terms of broader systemic changes that are necessary. But what I've done is try to take a different approach, which is, can I specify the simplest possible program for achieving at least the 20-year projection of cutting emissions by 40% to 20 billion tons. And here's the program. It's extremely simple. The program is you invest 1.5% to 2% of global GDP per year in clean energy investments. And by that, I mean investments in energy efficiency and in clean renewable energy. And so if you invest at 1.5% to 2% per year, what I've found in my research is that you can achieve this stabilization goal of cutting emissions to 20 billion tons within 20 years, while the economy continues to grow. And I think this is a very important point, because if we're going to talk about political solutions, there is no way that we're going to get where there's no way we're going to get to a 20% reduction if we fight over, reversing GDP growth. I assume that's going to be a bit of a controversial point, but I'm making it anyway. I'm not a proponent of degrowth, and so we have to frame our solution to climate stabilization within a framework of economic growth. So 1.5% of GDP to 2% a year, and burning fossil fuels, including natural gas, it cuts by 35% within 20 years, or 2.2% absolute cut. These are reasonable goals, and they will get us to the solution. Moreover, doing this investment program is going to be good for job opportunities, as I'll show in a second, and for economic growth. It is not good, however, for workers in the fossil fuel sector, obviously, and that therefore we have to merge a green investment agenda with a just transition agenda for fossil fuel sector workers. This is critical. Now, if you do those things, as I show here, we can get to a 20 billion ton target as of 2035. Moreover, what we're showing here is the research that I've done on job creation through this green investment agenda. And what I'm comparing is investments in clean energy at 1.5% of GDP per year, or for a given amount of $1 million per year, versus spending the same money in fossil fuels. And what we have is, this is for these countries, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, and the United States. What we have is investments in green energy are going to create 2 to 3 times more jobs per dollar. It's a critical point that a green energy investment program is good for jobs. I don't know about in every other country, but every country that I've worked in, the argument is always that we have these massive trade-offs. You can protect the environment, you can fight for climate stabilization. It's bad for jobs, it's bad for economic growth, and that is really the inflection point in these debates. I'm arguing quite the opposite. Investing in a green economic program is good for jobs, and it is perfectly consistent with a green growth program. Since some of our speakers are in Spain, I thought I'd focus for a second in Spain. This benefit of jobs and growth is particularly strong, of course, for countries that are right now importing fossil fuels. So what we found in the research in Spain is that you can get a massive 50% reduction in emissions, investing 1.5% of GDP. It's going to create directly 300,000 to 400,000 new jobs per year. And critically, obviously, fossil fuel imports fall from about 4% to 1% of GDP, which in turn, and this is critical, creates space for a broader alternative to austerity economics, which is what Spain and other countries in Europe need. Finally, I'd just add that the green growth agenda is fully consistent, and this gets back to what Dr. Brunig was saying, is fully consistent with what I can call a small is beautiful approach to development. I mean, I certainly think that there's a major role for public investment and public ownership in this investment program. However, we already have 90% of fossil fuel assets today are owned publicly. They're owned not by private corporations, but by public agencies such as Gazprom and Aramco in Saudi Arabia. What we see, though, with transition to green energy are opportunities for smaller scale public, private, and cooperative energy systems. These things are already sprouting, primarily in Europe, but also here in the United States. And it is creating opportunities for small scale, and if we think about opportunities for small scale energy development in rural countries like India, where you have 40% of the rural population not having any access to electricity at all at present. This is a massive benefit to a green investment agenda. Finally, on this issue of how we do it in a way that is fair and that we engage politically with different actors in society, the most fundamental question, I think, is the sharing of technology and financing. Dr. Brunig talked about financing. And the most important financing question, look, we need $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion of investment per year, not 100 billion. We need 10 times that. And so we need a capital fund, and a large part of the capital fund has to go to financing low-cost investments in poor countries. So if we think about India, China, Asia, Africa, where actually I'm going to speak in a few days on this and related issues, even if, as Dr. Brunig said, that Europe can hit its stabilization goals within 20 years, if India and China grow at 6 or 7% a year on the basis of a fossil fuel foundation in their economy, we will blow apart any stabilization prospects for hitting the stabilization goals. So the most critical thing is to finance 1.5% of GDP per year in every country, including India and China, and doing that through low-cost investment. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dr. Pauling. Dr. Gini, what's your say? You have to switch on your mic.
All right.
Yeah,
hello.
great.
You can hear me now, I guess. Well, thank you so much for having me and next to two so distinguished speakers. I'm not a doctor, so I'm feeling a bit foreigner in this circle. I do my best to try to bring something interesting to the debate. I guess if I try to compare what my two predecessors have said, I guess I'm leaning a bit more on the side of Dr. Bruining's because what Professor Pauling has proposed to us is, I guess, pretty much in line with what we can call green growth. And I think that green growth is a way for us to go to transition. But at the end of the day, I think that we need a real transition in the systems that we are using, that we are living in today. Like Professor Bruining, I said, you know, we not only have a problem of climate and of CO2 emissions, but also we have a problem of running short of productive soil, running short of forests, running short of ocean resources, but also running short of all kind of metals, like, for example, rare earth kind of metals. And this is quite important, and I would like to come back later on this one. And so the big question is, if we talk about growth, and my focus will be first on growth, is about the concept of decoupling. Are we facing now, and is it enough for us to have like what we call a relative decoupling? So we have the growth going up, and we have slightly more efficient resource, energy, and so forth system? Or do we need to go further and go for an absolute decoupling? Or third step, third question, even absolute decoupling won't be enough? Well, I guess on the first one, on the relative decoupling, I think the answer is quite easy, given the fact that we are facing demographic growth, and also, and I guess that's what we have to wish for our, you know, brothers around the earth, some kind of positive evolution of the material welfare of the people. I think relative growth, given all the constraints that we have in terms of limits to CO2 emissions and so forth, are not enough. So we need to go for absolute decoupling. Then the question is, how do we achieve that? The good news when I was preparing this morning was that the International Energy Agency was showing that there is, for the last 2 years, globally, a decoupling between the growth and CO2 emissions. So this is a good sign. My feeling and my fear is that it has more to do with some kind of incremental technology changes in terms of energy production, like for example, the fact that the Chinese are using much less coal than they used to, and using more renewable energy. So I think there is a way for us to go towards absolute decoupling, and through technology, but it might not be enough. So the question is really, is technology going to help us achieving this absolute decoupling or not? I was talking to a friend of mine who is head of the Boston Consulting Group here in Brussels, specialized in energy, and he was talking about his Tesla car, and we're talking about this question of energy for this kind of new technology. And the guy was saying, you know, I'm not driving my car anymore, and I can see that it's using much less gas than it used to than it does when I'm driving the car. So I guess, yes, of course, technology can play a role, but it might not be enough. Some other theories in favor of technologies are saying that man has been so bright and so creative in the whole history, and even more so now, that we might expect some kind of solutions coming from mankind creativity to tackle this absolute decoupling issue. Honestly, I'm not so sure about it. I think that we have also to face the fact that climate, like Professor Branning has said, is not an insulated issue, that we have many other issues in terms of biodiversity, of natural and general resources. And I want to mention a guy who is unfortunately not known enough outside of France, who's called Philippe Biwix, who wrote a book last year, a very successful book in French only, calling The Age of Low Technology, The Age of Low Tech. And his hypothesis is very interesting. He's saying that for all kinds of green growth, new kind of energies, renewable energies, technologies, and so forth, we will need more and more of steel and rare earth. And even if the earth and the earth crust is full of them, it will be more and more costly financially and from an energetical point of view to get those materials that we need to go towards this green growth. And so I guess, yes, even if I don't like the word degrowth, I prefer what Tim Jackson called prosperity without growth. I think that we need to reinvent, like Professor Branning said, a bit the system, and not be only active in terms of efficiency, but really in terms of change of paradigm. How are we going to do that? Well, you know, there is no direct way. And of course, like Professor Paulin was saying, growth is part of a social consensus, let's say, and it's still very important to preserve it. So I guess, of course, we need to direct growth and have a much more low CO2, low resources kind of growth. Of course, making sure that our most deprived brothers on earth are getting the essential that they need to live to lead a decent life. But at the same time, I think, yes, that the question of growth is on the table. That's one thing. Second thing, in terms of climate justice, we of course know the usual picture that we have, saying that, you know, poor countries are paying twice for, at the same time, the fact that they cannot develop as they would like to, and at the same time because they're already hit by climate change impact, of course. But I think it's very worth considering what Thomas Piketty did last year before Paris, the COP21 in Paris. And he was studying not the climate justice issue from a nations, let's say, point of view, but much more from an individual point of view. If I come back on my Boston Consulting Group friend, of course he's got a Tesla, but I think he's emitting much more CO2 and using much more resources than a guy in the suburb of Madrid who doesn't have any job, for example, or in the suburb of Sheffield, for example. So there is a environmental justice let's say that's an issue. There is an issue with environmental justice within the society. Hans Breunings had mentioned it a little bit, and I think indeed that we have to tackle it also. That means that the rich Indian people might be more emitting, emit more CO2 than jobless people in Europe. So having some kind of individual approach within the countries to make sure that there is more social justice and can provide also environmental justice is something that we should look at. And it's also the theory of some people like French professor. Sorry, I'm quite French oriented, but I guess I'm the only one speaking French on this webinar, so that's why I'm using it. Professor Robert Guenry from Collège de France, who was writing an article a few years ago saying that we should look at the CO2 emission from individual to individual and give some kind of equality throughout the whole population. Anyway, what do we need to do, and with whom are we going to do that? Well, I'm pretty much top down, coming from Greenpeace and also being linked to a political party here in Belgium. I'm pretty much top down, and I think that even if it's quite difficult, there was a few things that we should at least look at and if possible, and I guess it should be nice that it would be possible, do and implement. First of all, I think we have to reconsider all the indicators that we're using. The PIB, PNB, GPB, sorry, growth indicator is not enough. We know how much it has impact on the resources, or it doesn't say much about the resources that we're using, about the social inequalities and so forth. So I think the first step that we should do would be to reconsider the kind of indicators that we're using today. The second thing is quite familiar to economists in general, I guess. This is the concept of externalities. The fact that the deed that you do has impact on other people and from here, from outside of your country, and from future generations. And one, of course, the most evident thing to do at this stage, and other economists like Greg Mankiff are saying it, for example, is the fact that we should have some kind of carbon tax, carbon price and carbon tax. We need to take into account the externalities that the different activities that we're doing have on the environment, on the other people, and on the future generation. I mentioned the issue of inequality and climate justice. I think that we have to also be much more strict on tax justice in general within the different countries. Like Professor Bruynings has said, have some kind of financial tax. We know how much it's difficult to see the amount of money being engaged in financial markets, and not much money coming back in the pockets of the community that we are part of. If we look at European level, there are some, in terms of resources, in terms of regulations. We have the plans for 2030. We have the PAC, agriculture common policy, the common fishery policy, all kind of policies that have to do with resources, and they have to reorient themselves in a much more sustainable way. I'm talking to you from Namur. I don't know whether you guys know Namur. Namur is the capital of Wallonie. You might have not heard about Wallonie before 2 weeks ago, but maybe a bit more now, after all the CETA discussion, this agreement between EU and Canada, and the fact that Wallonie was quite resistant to it. And I think indeed, it was not mentioned enough, according to me, but the impact of commercial and trade agreements on the environment and on climate in particular are totally underestimated. We cannot at the same time have a big agreement in Paris and at the same time launch a few other purely trade agreements and commercial agreements and not take the two into account. So that doesn't mean I'm against the trade agreements, but I think we need to reconsider them in the light of the climate issues that we are facing. And finally, the overconsumption that Professor Bruynings was mentioning is really part of our society. And so I think, of course, we need some kind of new cultural model. One of the possibilities, even it's still quite vague and unclear, is the common approach, reinvent the notion of property. And it's not new, it was used under the Greek and under the Romans, I guess. There's different kind of property like the commons are, and I think we should look for that. So this is quite top-down. And what we see is the difficulty for politicians to be pushed by the citizens. And it's the kind of schizophrenia between the guy who is signing a petition for climate and at the same time goes overconsumed the next day. So what we see here in Belgium that's kind of working is really the bottom-up initiatives, like, for example, the transition towns. So I think that we have to build some kind of movement based on those people who are in their daily life trying to contribute, trying to change the way they live, the way they consume, and connect them to the larger picture, more top-down picture, to make sure that bottom-up and top-down will join and will make some kind of impact on the urgent needs to reorient our economy that we need if we want to be a sustainable society. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Monsieur Génie. So you gave to us already a lot of very interesting contribution to think about, and we have already a lot of questions from the public. So I had several questions myself to ask, but I think it's fair to give more room to the public. That's why I would like just to ask one question to Dr. Pollin, if you agree, because basically we are talking about how to change the economy to save the environment. So you spoke about this very interesting aspect of creating jobs, because right now it's very important, it's very relevant to people, creating jobs with the green economy, let's say, with a transition from an old style economy to a new one. Then you gave us some figures, some very interesting figures. My question is, and in the meantime, I mean, in Europe, but I'm pretty sure also in the United States, happens that when an enterprise, whatever, has to close down because it's too dirty, let's say, his environmental impact is too strong. There is really a lot of workers' movement, let's say, to oppose this, because these workers could lose their work, their jobs. We are saying that they could find another job with a new, cleaner environment. So my question is, in the meantime, in this period, what happened to these workers? How can this new economy assure also the workers that cannot stay 1 year without their job to reconvert in a greener way? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. And of course, in every experience, a place where I've been involved in talking and meeting people, this is a fundamental question that comes up over and over and over and over and over again. Not the debate, degrowth versus no growth, which I'm happy to engage in, and I have strong views on that, but the jobs issue. And, you know, so the point is that we absolutely must engage in investing in energy efficiency and clean renewable energy. And that, you know, by 2050, we have to be emissions free, and we can get there. And so my own research and other people shows the calculations through getting there. Now, it so happens that when you do that, any investment in anything creates jobs. So this notion that building a green economy is going to be bad for jobs is contrary to what we know about anything. I mean, you spend money, you can spend it on the military, you can spend it on fossil fuels, or you can spend it on a green economy. You will create jobs. So the question is, how many? And what our research has shown, and I've done it for countries all over the world now, including the US, and I was a consultant to the U.S. Energy Department under Obama's stimulus, green stimulus, on exactly this point. You get 2 to 3 times more jobs per dollar of expenditure. Green investments are good for jobs on net. Now, it doesn't mean that the coal miners get to keep their jobs. They don't. Okay, they will lose their jobs, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to deal with it. The only way to deal with that is to give them what the late great labor leader Tony Mazzocchi called just transition. I have done work on the specifics of just transition and what are the main things that you need. Well, you need reemployment guarantees. And you can do that because you can move people into the green economy and you guarantee it. These green investments are going to be subsidized. They're either going to be public or private, but they're going to be subsidized. Part of the subsidy is employment guarantees for people transitioning out of fossil fuels. Secondly, you need to have them, what I call compensation insurance, meaning they don't lose income. So at least for 5 years, their income is guaranteed at their previous job. And third, we need community reinvestment. Now, that has to be a central part of the green project, because otherwise, it's in terms of justice issues and in terms of political reality, in terms of moving the agenda forward, unless you deal with job losses in the fossil fuel economy, you won't have the political strength to move the agenda forward. And as we all know, we have no time. We have to do this right now.
Thanks very much, Dr. Pauling. I would switch immediately to the questions of the public. They are many. Cecilia Blanchet asked if there is a place in the EU policies to move from competition to collaboration. So if, I suppose she means that if there is any at European level that can boost this move. Who of you want to answer?
Yeah, I'm happy to take part of that. Well, my understanding of the question is that is there a more integrated approach at the European level that is promoting this sort of transitional policies? And I would say increasingly, yes, we have these long-term integrated frameworks for policy making. We have the frameworks on climate and energy. That is a package that looks at 2030 in light of an official decarbonization trend line that goes to 2050. We have the energy union that will be translated in policies, and that looks at not only energy security and at investments, but also at the clear interactions with climate policies over the long term, and that will stimulate absolutely necessary collaboration between EU member states when it comes to establishing the network, the infrastructure for a renewable energy-based system. You have the circular economy package that came out in December 2015, and that will be translated into more than 50 concrete initiatives that has a long-term perspective. And Europe normally very soon will come out also with a European regional response to the SDGs. So I would say increasingly we see an integrated long-term policy framing with targets and objectives of which we all know that they will not be reached by the current technological and policy paradigm. You cannot decarbonize the car and transport system based on the combustion engine. You cannot decarbonize the energy system by building more efficient carbon-based power plants. So that is these sorts of approaches are increasingly embedded in these long-term European trajectories. And of course, the whole discourse about growth and jobs is part of it. And we can also demonstrate that this is not just something for the future. In fact, since the year 2000, the European economy has been rather stable in jobs, mainly due to the crisis after 2008, 2009, with the big exception of the green economy jobs, which have increased since that time period and outperformed all other job creation. And even since the crisis of 2008, we see an increase in that type of job. So that's an indicator. But more fundamentally, let's assume that it would not create any additional job. Yeah, would we then say we don't need to move to the circular or low carbon economy? Of course not. If something is in essence unsustainable, it literally means that it will not be sustainable. Yeah, and we are already using 1.4 planets. As people say, well, everybody knows that there is no 0.4 planet, right? It means that we continuously overuse, deplete the current one, the one that we have. which means that our chances of living well within the limits of that one planet by 2050 are decreasing every single day. So I think the very fundamental reason of going in that direction is the planetary boundaries that are the condition for the economy of the 21st century, even if it would not create a single job. Now, I'm totally on the side of Dr. Pollen on this when he says that study after study after study illustrate that it is in fact beneficial for the economy in many ways, also in job creation, to move in that direction. But I make a distinction between the fundamental logic and the sort of applied logic and co-benefits of moving in that direction.
Thanks. From European policies to American policies, Federico asked, how could the result of the US presidential election influence the US strategy towards climate change? This is maybe for Dr. Pollen again.
Hi, thank you. Well, today is a big day here. In fact, after I get done with this, I'm going to go vote. Look, Donald Trump, in terms of climate policy, is an absolute catastrophe. I say this, I happen to not be a big fan of Hillary Clinton, but I want to say that Donald Trump is an absolute catastrophe. He's saying he wants to rip up the Paris Agreement. I just said the Paris Agreement itself is certainly a step in the right direction, but is nowhere close to being adequate to achieving any reasonable climate stabilization goal. If Donald Trump is elected, you know, every single person who cares about the future of the planet is going to have to be mobilizing just to prevent Donald Trump and the government that he would lead to moving us in the opposite direction. Okay, so that's where we are with Trump. With Clinton, I think that you know, on paper, her proposals all sound good. They're more or less where we move with respect to Obama, and you know, Obama moved us in the right direction. Not nearly far enough, and not nearly with enough force. And I think that's more or less where we would end up with Hillary Clinton. I actually don't think that her platform is as good as Obama's was 8 years ago when he was first elected. For example, Hillary Clinton has refused, you know, to come out against fracking. Just on fracking alone, if we were to, you know, eliminate every single coal plant and burn natural gas and extract the natural gas through fracking, there's almost no benefit at all in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. So Hillary Clinton's program is not nearly adequate. It is, you know, dramatically better than Trump. At least you can have a reasonable argument with Hillary Clinton and her proponents. So that's where we are today.
Thanks, Dr. Pollen. Mr. Genet, do you think that some changes in the economic system will be implemented concretely in the following years after the Paris Agreement?
Well, I'm quite desperate about it. You know, like Dr. Pollen said, if we have Donald Trump, it would be even worse. But even Hillary is not that good, and we see many governments in Europe where I am, you know, not very much worried about climate issue, environmental issue. So I don't know. I hope that there is, I guess, a stronger consensus, at least among the within the academical world, and also within some politicians, on the CO2 tax and CO2 price, at least. So I guess on that one, we should maybe be able to reach something in the coming 5 to 10 years. But there is still a long way to go. I guess one of the most interesting country to follow is maybe China, because we knew, and Dr. Breinings knows that much better than I do, that before 2011, China was one of the bad pupils of the class, of the climate class. and then something happened in 2011. And I guess one of the some experts are saying that the pressure, the popular pressure from the population, how amazing it could be to have popular pressure in a country like China. At least the middle class was much worried about environmental issues, pollution, and so forth, and that what's made them flip over and become a much more committed climate pupil in the class. So sometimes things can happen, and I guess once you feel the direct effect of climate change, through air pollution, for example, like in China, maybe then the politicians are pushed to come up with some changes. So I guess, I hope at least that on green taxes, we will see some changes in the future. I hope so.
Thanks, Mr. Genet. Another question for you, maybe, as you talk about international trade agreements. Diego asked if would be moving from globalization towards localization a fruitful strategy, your opinion?
Well, I mean, that's a very, very interesting question, because at the same time, many of us within the green movement are saying that we need to relocalize the economy, relocalize the energy. Professor Pauline was talking about, all the imports in Spain and so forth. So I guess, yes, in some, I guess the trade paradigm, the open trade paradigm has to be changed to integrate this environmental consequences of trades. We know that in some, if you compare the CO2 linked to production from a country, if you compare it to the CO2 consumption linked to the same country, you see some more CO2 coming from the US, for example, when you look at their consumption than at their production, because of the fact that they externalize the production in China, for example, in Asia. So I guess this whole paradigm has to be relooked at. And I guess, again, an international carbon tax would readjust the trade in a way that would be much more sustainable. That would be my answer.
Thanks. Dr. Brunix, what are your expectations of the Marrakesh summit?
Well, I think it's clear now, after the Paris Agreement that is now active, that it will need to be filled in. I mean, we will need probably several years to make it concrete in all of its components. And there are financial components. There are components of making sure that we have a proper monitoring and reporting mechanism. There are components that are linked to creating more national plans. There are components of international collaboration. There are underestimated linkages, increasingly understood, with natural capital. We are rather far away from a good understanding of adaptation policies and how they are formulated at national and more local levels. There are endless issues that will need to become concrete and translated not only in public policies, but also in private policies. And with private policies, I want to make it clear as well that, and we work on that in the agency as well, if you're the CEO of a big corporation, you're of course also a policy maker. You make policies that span the globe in terms of production chains. So policy making, I think we need to get over this public-private distinction. Not that there is no distinction, but the two are often intimately connected to each other in many different ways. So that's all of that is part of Marrakesh. And now that we have managed to get Marrakesh going within 1 year, with enough ratifications and commitment, which is a sharp contrast with the Kyoto Protocol, if I might say that. It was negotiated in '97 and it became operational in 2005. So this is a much stronger and faster breakthrough and operationalization. We now have to get to work and make it really functional. So that Marrakesh is the first step along that road. That's I think what I expect there. Concrete steps that are being taken in the right direction.
Thanks, Dr. Brunix. We have several questions that I would like to sum up here. They basically are asking, what can an individual citizen do in his normal life to boost this switch of interest, also at great level in economic towards a more climate and environment justice. Maybe Dr. Pauline and Mrs. Genet could help us to find a solution.
Thank you. Well, starting with the individual level, I mean, I think obviously we need to reduce our consumption of any fossil fuel, and we need to drive less in fossil fuel based cars. We need to we need to be conscious. We need to put up solar panels. You mentioned at the beginning, which I appreciate, that I actually started a company here that we engage in financing energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. So that's good. And that should be done at all levels and in all societies. In terms of politics, you know, what we have to do is move the environmental imperative to being the single most important issue on anybody's agenda. For example, here in the US, Bernie Sanders, who was a candidate in the primary against Hillary Clinton, said that the climate issue is the most important question. That doesn't mean that you ignore other things. In fact, what I'm trying to show is that by investing in a green economy, you also address other things. You address inequality, you address jobs, you address healthcare in terms of co-benefits. I agree with Dr. Brunig that this, talking about the co-benefits, we would undertake the activities even without the co-benefits, but the co-benefits are extremely important and they shouldn't be understated. So politically, we need to build political programs that are at the center of mainstream parties. And that's what I've been working on. And, you know, the brief material I presented on Spain was done at the request of Podemos. So Podemos as a political party is, done pretty well in the last few years. I would like to see them move the green agenda front and center as integrated into their anti-austerity agenda. So there's a big political project, and then there's an individual component to it, and we need to integrate those.
Well, just to add to what Professor Pauline has said, and with which I fully agree, of course, I would just add coming from Greenpeace, this is quite expected from me, at the civil society engagement. I find, for example, the 350.org campaign on Divest quite a beautiful campaign with maybe some impact. At least this is one of the few campaigns that reach some kind of international level. So yes, look at the website of organizations like this, 350, Greenpeace, of course, Klimaatzaak in Netherlands, where they've been in front of the court to say that the government is not taking its responsibility towards the current and future generation. They've won the case. So there are, quite a bunch of citizen initiatives. They're quite interesting, and they need the support of everybody, just everybody, next to the political party aspect and next to what Professor Pauline was describing as the daily kind of acts that you can do in favor of a more sustainable planet.
Thanks very much. I'd like to ask the last questions, unfortunately, as the time passed very, very quickly. Change the economy to save the climate. This is the name of the webinar. The question is, what role could the sharing economy, so the new economy that is pumping up in the last years, play in this respect? Everybody can answer.
Well, I'm not a specialist of it, and I would like to study it a bit more deeper. My very quick reflection is that Airbnb, for example, is very nice, but if it makes people take more planes than what they used to, I guess this is not quite beneficial for the climate. So the concept of reusing resources like the sharing economy is as such good, but you're still using resources. You're not producing maybe that many resources anymore, but you're still using them. So I think it still has to be studied thoroughly what exactly the impact of sharing economy can be on the whole environmental system. This is just my 2 cents, I would say.
Dr. Pauling?
I don't think I agree. I don't think it necessarily is beneficial. You know, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, period. There's no reason to think that using Airbnb or using, you know, some kind of car sharing system is going to be better or worse. You know, if we want to think about a transportation system that is going to help environmentally, I think we think about public transportation, not putting more cars on the road of any kind. So I don't see that as central. I think we need to struggle around the fundamental need of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions, and doing the specific things and through various institutional forms. That's what, you know, I say small is beautiful. It does work. And, you know, actually the one thing that I should have emphasized that I haven't, and I don't think has been emphasized enough overall in the discussion, is that the costs of renewable energy have been coming down dramatically, such that they are renewable energy electricity on average is at parity globally with coal. And that is that's revolutionary in and of itself. So that we don't have to make the argument that you are bearing excessive costs to pursue an environmental agenda. It is consistent with lower costs or at least no sacrifices. And that's a framework in which, yes, a carbon tax can work, because you put up the carbon tax, people are going to be screaming about the tax. You say, but okay, but you can get renewable energy for the same price. So I think these things are more important than thinking about prospects from Airbnb or other kinds of share economy enterprises.
Dr. Brunix, final words?
Final words? Well, that's a big... I do agree with the statements on the sharing economy, but I would not reduce it to the couple of examples that are now always used, Airbnb, Uber, and other things. You can do a lot of sharing economy at a very low-key level, at the local level as well. It goes from tool libraries over sharing spaces in houses and in public facilities. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which this can work without falling in the trap of individualizing the responsibility for sustainability to the individual consumer that has to make the smart choices and then the system will follow. No, you always make a choice as a consumer within a system. So it's this sort of structure and agency problem, as it's often called in the social sciences, that will need to move forward in a sort of symbiotic or antagonistic way as it happens. If I have the final word, I would like to come back to a fundamental issue that was raised, the issue of growth. Yeah, I often fear that we have a very reductionist view there. I've done quite a bit of my research in Africa, and I've been in Latin America and worked in Asia, and I always am a bit fearful when intellectuals from, let's say, OECD countries say that it's a good decision to stop growing now. I mean, for me, it's obvious that we need massive growth on this planet if we want to go to a just society. Growth in housing, growth in healthcare opportunities, growth in basic infrastructure, growth in education, growth in decent food, growth in all of these things for a couple of billion of people on this planet. So the issue of no further growth on this planet is, in my vision, rather nonsensical. What will be important is where, what the distribution will be of costs and benefits, what type of growth, because you can grow in environmentally very harmful ways in Africa, or you can make a technology jump and make Africa the next best place for renewable energy. So, but I'm always a bit scared when I hear people from our type of background, and I see most of the people here on the little camera, so I can say from our type of background, proclaim to the rest of the world that it's now enough with growth, we have enough, so it's better that we stop growing, when there is a need for billions of people on the very fundamentals that make for a decent life on this planet. So that's what I would say on that topic.
Well, just a word, just to make sure that I fully agree with Dr. Brunnings. Of course, you know, I make the distinction maybe not clearly enough between the intensive CO2 resources growth and the growth that we need, of course.
Well, can I just toss in my thing? So I appreciate what you just said, that I feel very, very strongly about this. And to promote myself, I have a book called Greening the Global Economy. I discuss this issue of no growth, degrowth. I've debated people. You can find it online, including Peter Victor. I respect them a lot. I fundamentally disagree. We will not address the vast problems of inequality and poverty in the world without growth. That's just a fact. Moreover, it is not a solution to climate stabilization. You know, as I said, we have 32 billion tons per year now of CO2. Let's say we cut growth by 10% and we don't change the energy system at all. Well, then you cut CO2 emissions by 10%. So you go down from 32 billion tons to 29 billion tons. It's not a solution at all. So yes, people in rich countries need to consume less. I agree with that, including myself. I'm flying off to Africa in 3 days, so I'll be using a lot of CO2 to do that. But the fundamental proposition is to couple equitable growth, egalitarian growth with green energy system and a green environmental project. And so I think that it's something that we who are really concerned with climate change, I really respect Peter Victor. I disagree with him. And if people want to see that we had a debate online, you can see our discussion.
Well, unfortunately, we really ran out of time. The discussion is very interesting, and the topic would deserve hours of debate. But unfortunately, we don't have any more time. So I would like to thank the speakers for being with us. I want to remind you that this webinar has been recorded, so everybody will be able to watch what we said. It is the whole discussion online in the coming days. Thank you very much from Brussels, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.